Preparing right now to go live. Thank you all who are watching right now. We're about to get started. And we are live. Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for attending. Thank you for all of you who will go back and watch when you get a chance. My name is Jesus Smith. I'm an assistant professor of ethnic studies at Lawrence University here in Appleton, Wisconsin. And I was selected as a community member to compete on a competition and fundraiser for the Sexual Assault Crisis Center of the Fox Cities called Shall We Dance Fox Cities? And essentially, it's kind of like Dancing with the Stars. You get paired up with really well-known studios in the Fox Cities, dancing studios. I was paired with Boogie Ballroom, which is a great dancing studio. And we basically compete against each other, but what we're really doing is we're fundraising for resources for the Sexual Assault Crisis Center, because the center provides a lot of resources to people in the community that are free of charge. So people who are dealing with sexual assault and violence, which is a huge impact mentally, so much to deal with, but the center provides legal services, it provides psychological services, it does all of this sort of work in the community, and it does it for free. And so this is kind of the big fundraisers that they put on that I'm so happy to be a part of. And there's many reasons why I wanted to do it. And today's conversation is just kind of one of those. As a professor, I wanted to do a different sort of way. I wanted to connect in a different sort of way with the community. And so one of the things I wanted to do as an educator was educate as much as possible. So that meant, taking this subject and bringing awareness to the community. And I wanted to do it in different ways. And so it wasn't just focusing on the broader discussions and the broader ideas that people have, but focusing on communities that I think are very much harmed by sexual assault and violence, but don't get the spotlight. Last month I talked about, the queer community, especially in the Fox Cities, but broadly. The month before that, in May, I did a talk called Men Can Stop Rape, because I wanted to talk about all the ways that there's, some argue those multiple masculinities, they're not all toxic and negative, and that we can use our masculinity in really positive ways. And so that was the goal of that discussion. And then this one is particularly important to me, and really important because it was about sexual assault and violence as it's directed towards Black boys and Black men, which oftentimes, as we know historically, the idea is that we are the immediate rapists. It's in our blood. It's the stereotype that's perpetuated in society all the time. It's just assumed, it's always talked about. And I just felt like it was my duty to have this really important conversation that countered a lot of those stereotypes, that brought a lot of empirical information and data to the conversation. And the goal is obviously to really address and rid of sexual assault as it's targeted towards Black boys and men, but the Black community in general and everywhere, And so I turned to my mentor, Dr. Tommy Curry, who I had the pleasure of getting to know at Texas A&M. And I was following you back in the day when you were doing Talking Tough with Dr. Curry and listening to a lot of conversations. And I will say, I grew so much in that process, because I think one of the things that you did that was really important for my intellectual growth was challenge a lot of the beliefs that I just assumed were true, just because it's kind of like the practice in academia. You get taught a certain way, and for some reason, a lot of us don't ever question the ways that we're taught. And I always appreciated one of the first conversations we had. We went to the movies together, me, you, Todd, and Danny. I think we all went to the movies together, and I was so surprised because you had such critiques of such mainstream ideas, but you countered every single time with something from a Black womanist or a Black queer scholar that was actually critiquing those ideas back in the day. And so every time I felt kind of like, what? This was such a challenge to what I believed. It was hard for me to be angry, because it was like, oh, you were providing something else for me to look at. And it actually introduced me to so much out there, like Hutchinson I never knew before. I never knew a multidimensionality. And so it was such a pleasure to be, introduced to so many different ideas. And that sort of thinking is so important in this discussion about violence in our communities, especially where it's coming from, how to think about it, how to address it. If we don't counter a lot of what gets perpetuated, it can't be addressed. So I knew that you were the person that I needed to have this conversation with. It is something that I know is deeply personal to you and I. Protecting Black people in general, of course, all Black people, but especially in this talk, we are really putting our emphasis on Black boys and men. And I think there is just no conversation about that. Absolutely. And so this was really important for me. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Tommy, for dedicating your time to this. Dr. Curry, this means so much to me, and I really appreciate you. Those of you who are interested at the end of this, who want to support, I will post my link and you can donate. All those funds go to the Sexual Assault Crisis Center here in town as we, again, do the work that we need to educate the public and to stop sexual assault and violence. So I want to start off by first kind of giving you an introduction for people who don't know you, which is surprising to me if people don't, but just a little bit about you. Dr. Curry, everyone, is an American scholar. He's an author and he's a professor of philosophy. His book, which was a real big game changer for many of us, The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, it won the American Book Award in 2018. And he is currently the personal chair in Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh. I am, again, so thank you for you doing this conversation with me. And I want us to just go ahead and get started. Sure. So my first question for you, Dr. Curry, is about this article that you wrote that I thought was really, really important. And I think it can lay the foundation for our entire conversation today. But it's called She Touched Me, 5 Snapshots of Adult Violations of Black Boys. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think when Dr. Ali and I first started having this conversation, it was really based off of frustration that I had because, I'm always into evidence despite being a philosopher. So, I started talking a lot about how some of the data sets that were coming out with the CDC that I'll show a little bit later start really showing that Black boys, Black men were given accounts of early sexual experiences and really reporting higher rates of made to penetrate violence. When I showed this data to philosophers, they were not impressed. They didn't care about the 12-month prevalence or the lifetime prevalence increasing. So I said, let me take a different strategy. So Ebony and I decided that, look, well, let's interview Black men about their first sexual experiences and really capture the stories of how Black men were both thinking about early sexual experiences and how they thought about sexual violations or statutory rape. And what we got from this article was really profound because it really shows that young Black boys, even when they're grown men, because remember, these are Black men thinking back into their childhood, really didn't have a language to talk about the sexual violations or statutory rape. One of the reasons that we start off with kind of the analog of if a 15-year-old girl has sex with a 20-year-old man, would we consider it rape? Is because this is one of the questions that we asked many of the people that we interviewed, where they would give us these accounts of being 9-year-olds and being paid to have oral sex with older women, but not understanding that that was a sexual violation or coercive or even statutory rape. But immediately when we told them, well, what if this was a young girl? Would you think that absolutely they understood that to be rape automatically? Yeah. So what the stories revealed is not only that these Black men had a deep sense and detailed experiences of their own sexual violation that they remembered from when they were and from their childhood, but it also showed they didn't have a language, a way to connect their sexual vulnerability as Black men with the actual experiences of statutory rape that they suffered. And I think that in itself is a huge research finding, because what it shows is that the language and the theories that we've kind of, promulgated throughout our discourse over the last 30 and 40 years that have dominantly asserted that Black men are rapists has had a profound impact on how we socialize young Black men and boys. And because these young Black men and boys are having really early sexual experiences, most of the people that we interviewed showed that they had experiences with older women, often caretakers or friends of the family, that they were being paid, they were being coerced, they were being lied to, right? These are all really important aspects to really give us a personalized picture of what's happening in our communities. Young Black boys are extremely vulnerable to sexual violation and sexual coercion. And despite the fact that the numbers and the stories demonstrate that this is a very real experience, we don't have the kind of activism and recognition that's trying to educate young Black boys about what it means to be a victim of sexual assault and trauma. And that's profoundly important because as Black boys get older, as you know, this leads to risky sexual behaviors, it leads to interpersonal issues, it leads to more likely being the perpetrator and victim of intimate partner violence. I mean, it leads to things like depression and deleterious health consequences. So even from a public health standpoint, it's just so important that we get a grasp on this and see how young Black boys are suffering because it leads to them being traumatized and often neglected older Black men.
Wow, that's incredible. You bring up so many great points with this article. Was there any part, I mean, all the stories, all the snapshots are really important. Are there any that you think really drive home this idea that you're saying about why language is so important and the vulnerabilities that Black boys have?
Well, obviously, there was one story that we did include into the snapshot that a young Black man, educated Black man, shared with me, and I talk about it a lot because it created so many traumas in his life later on. He was actually around 8 or 9, and he was learning to swim, and he was very nervous, in the pool. When you first learn to swim, you don't want to go into deep end. So he said that two of his peers, roughly 11 and 12, if I remember correctly, he said two young Black girls drew him to the deep end of the pool. And he was scared, right, for his life. He thought he was going to drown. He was just kind of paralyzed. And he, held on to the side of the pool. And while he was holding on to the side of the pool, both of them took turns performing oral sex on him. And he explained that, when he tried to tell people this, they made fun of him. They suggested he consider himself lucky. But the kind of trauma he experienced associated swimming, right, the fear of drowning and oral sex, right, that kind of affection from a woman, it followed him his whole life. And one of the reasons that I think that story is important and really demonstrates the vulnerability is because he was a 9-year-old boy, and these were two older girls that did this to him in a world where the environment was like he thought he could drown. He feared for his life in a very real way. And when I tell people these stories, or when they even read these stories, I don't think they understand the kind of fear that's often associated with Black men's experiences of sexual violence. Because we condition the Black boys to basically accept any kind of violence that comes their way. And I don't mean just sexual violence here, as you know. I mean, even when people are being shot in the streets, when Black men are being shot that look just like them, we don't take the time to consider, well, what's the mental health aspects or impacts this has on a young Black male population? That's practically non-existent in the literature currently. Right. We don't consider how Black men feel about the world. We don't consider what they take in from them. And what I think these stories demonstrate is that these sexual violations, these early sexual experiences, had profound impacts on these young Black boys, and it resonated throughout their lives, in their relationships with their children, and their relationships with other women. Right?
Wow, that is, yeah, really profound, really painful, actually, to think about how often this happens. And yeah, again, I just think what you said about having the language, the way to actually talk about this is super important, because I can still see, and I'm sure we all, or you and I and those of us kind of doing this work, do see how difficult it is for people to put this into words, what's happening and the sort of impact. Could you elaborate more on, the impact of this sort of sexual assault on Black boys and men, what it does?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we outline all this in the article, but, just depression, low self-esteem, feeling disconnected from your body. I mean, one of the stories that we talk about where a young boy was paid to have oral sex with his mother's older friend, talks about the self-esteem issues he had when she rejected him. And he got older, wanted to pursue a relationship with her. She rejected him, told him no. So the only kind of physical affection and love that he understood as a young boy was taken away from him when he felt that he was becoming a man and could actually actively or agentically engage in a consensual relationship. and then it was denied. So, from that story, you see all kinds of issues that develop in terms of his body image, in terms of his self-esteem, his views
Mhm.
about women. He created an oral sex fixation, where I believe he says that he had oral sex with almost 100 women, right? These things matter. And again, it's because we don't see boys generally, but Black boys especially, as being impressionable, right? And a large part of that comes because of our cultural conditioning. A lot of the gender theory that's out there right now suggests that Black boys are just hypersexual, that
Mhm.
sexual activity is just part of their nature, that they're coercive, that they're actually rapists, right? Like this is what
Mhm.
we're getting when we're reading something like Bell Hooks, right? That we're teaching young Black boys to be a beast or a buck. But that's not what the research demonstrates. It demonstrates that Black boys are extremely vulnerable, that they recount these painful experiences in a myriad of ways. Some Black boys suggest that they were agentic, like the woman wanted them. Some of them, withdraw from women and sex altogether. Some of them see caretakers as dangerous, and some of them have distrust of women and never find love. Like these are things that impact heterosexual Black men at a very real level. And even when we had a few snapshots of same-sex violations, it led to the same kind of distrust of elder men in the community, and created distance in relationships. And one thing I do want to point out, though, that I think is really important is that in our follow-up study with the same data set, uh, we actually looked at how Black boys are reacting, right, to this kind of vulnerability. Like if Black boys got to choose their sexual partners, what do they choose? And our research shows, again, using snapshots and case studies, really does show that Black boys choose amorous relationships. They choose sex with their friends. They choose sex with people who understand them, who care for them. So what we need to really put this in some context. Young Black boys
Mhm.
are having early sexual experiences and experience statutory rape through physical or coercive violence are really being robbed of a certain kind of choice. Said differently, I think that what we think is that Black boys would choose the same sexual experience regardless if they were assaulted or not. And our research does not show that. It shows that Black boys want connections. They want people who understand them, that make them feel good about their first time, their first sexual intercourse, which is why they choose friends. And this cuts in face of 30 or 40 years of theory, which suggests that Black boys just want to have sex and they don't care who it's with. It shows a deeply emotional, deeply sensitive psychological makeup of Black men and boys, that's quite vulnerable to sexual coercion and doesn't have any outlets to actually communicate the pain or deal with the trauma once that kind of violence does happen.
Wow. I want to continue on with something you said that really struck me, that's really important. Why is it so important to provide historical and sociological and empirical context to the sexual assault that we see in Black communities? Because I feel like one of the flaws that can happen is, or that is happening, is people who don't know anything about the Black community take these ideas outside of the Black community and apply them to our communities.
Yeah.
And so, but we have a very particularly, especially in the US context, but honestly in several different contexts, like it's very, very different, right? And so why is
Yes.
that so important? You had mentioned why context matters here and why we need to understand
Well, I mean, at a very basic level, we're not white people. And the
that.
demographic patterns that we see in the white population don't necessarily mirror our population. Actually, I'd love to show this to you. I could just show you the data, right? So, like, even when you're looking at, so there was an article that came out in 2019 that's talking about prevalence of sexual initiation or first sexual intercourse in adult males before the ages of 13. And the data is pretty clear. Like, and this is a historical pattern that when you're looking at Black boys generally report higher numbers of having sexual intercourse before the age of 13. Now, remember, the age of consent does vary state by state, but I think the lowest age of consent, which was Kansas a few years ago, was 16 years of age. So even if you take the lowest state number, it's usually around 18. Most of these experiences, at least 20% or 21%, if you're looking at the high level of the confidence interval for non-Hispanic Black boys, is still going to be considered statutory rape, right? This is important because it's suggesting to us, remember that most of the reports that Black boys have are usually of older Black women, right? It's their first sexual experience or their sexual debut. So these patterns differ, right, than what we traditionally think of as sexual assault or sexual abuse. When you look at the conversation developing in the white American population, you're looking at people largely talk about the vulnerability of women, how women have been coerced into early sexual activity, and that's considered rape. And those patterns also disproportionately hold in the Black race, but the Black race also has this other component, which is that you also have the sexual abuse of young Black boys, because young Black boys were never thought that they could give consent. They didn't, it was no thought as to whether or not they would ever object to sex. And I'll be very honest with you, there are people in the academy that I've presented this data to who have flat out said, well, you can't rape a Black boy. And I thought that was the most atrocious and repugnant thing you could say. And I was like, well, explain the reasoning behind your thought that you can't rape Black boys. And they said, because they always want to. So even in the academy, right, amongst educated people, there is still this racialized belief that young Black boys don't want to say no to sex, so you can't really rape them. And this is the same kind of racist tropes you find in the Jezebel, as we know, that we thought that was repugnant during slavery, suggests you can't rape Black women because that by their very nature. But we import this on young Black boys, and we think that this is a viable gender theory or a theory of toxic masculinity, because we're already assuming a hypersexualization is associated with simply being a Black boy, no matter how young or old that person may be.
That's really terrible. That it doesn't surprise me, but it still like sits in my stomach in a really awful way that somebody would think that. But this brings me to my other question. Why do you think why is this such a problem in the academy, for instance? Definitely, obviously, you address in your work the problems in philosophy that I think are important, but the academy in general, why is this such an issue, such a struggle for people to actually face?
Well, the U.S. academies are as ideological as they are empirical. And we have to understand that it's the ideology that's actually guiding what people study, what people say that people can study, and then whether or not people like graduate students and young scholars are being encouraged to ask serious research questions. I'll give you just concrete examples. This is the 2010-2012 state report that was published in 2017 by the CDC. This is basically a snapshot. It's cross-sectional data or survey data that's looking at people's experiences of sexual violence, contact sexual violence, intimate partner violence, et cetera. So if you look at like lifetime and 12-month prevalence of contact sexual violence of women in the United States, we get what's consistent with the narrative, right? A disproportionate amount, if you're looking at weighted percentages, of Black women talking about contact sexual violence, stalking, intimate partner violence, et cetera. But that's where the story often stops in the academy, right? They'll look at table 5.3. But if you look at table 5.6, right, in the very same data set, look at what you also find. Look at the lifetime prevalence and 12-month prevalence of contact sexual violence, physical violence, and stalking for young Black men, right? That's 11.6%. That's 1.4, roughly 1.5 million victims in a 12-month period, right? And notice that doesn't differ very significantly from the Black women who are also disproportionately victims in a 12-month period. Slightly outnumbers, but of course not that significant, right? But you're looking at a basic equality of victimization in Black communities that no one really pays attention to. So the academy stops short of actually questioning or being seriously true to the kind of empiricism that it says that we should embrace. And look, if you look at this, even specifically looking at sexual violence by race and ethnicities, you see the kind of disproportionate rates you get with contact sexual violence and rape amongst Black women. You see it with multiracial women. You see it with Hispanic women. Things that we know that race creates kind of a culminating effect of vulnerability in some circumstances. But again, we see the same thing even more so with Black men, right? The weighted percentage of 6.5% in a 12-month period is an important finding, because it's suggesting to us that when you're talking about contact sexual violence and made to penetrate violence, meaning that young boys or men are being forced to penetrate other bodies, you see rates that are equal, if not outreaching many women groups in the United States. But the United States Academy says, well, men can't be victims, and Black men especially can't be sexual victims, because so much of our gender theory has depended on the idea of men as perpetrators, right? So even talking about the Me Too movement and Terry Crews, right? One of the articles I published around that circumstance. While Crews is certainly a victim, and certainly a victim by Weinstein and other groups of another man, right? The question doesn't become, is Terry Crews the pinnacle, right, or par excellence of the victim, but is he the typical victim? And the reality is that this data shows that he's not the typical victim, right? In fact, when we look at the perpetrators of sexual violence against men, we find, yes, men do assault other men. That's given. It's absolutely true. We see it in the data all the time. When we're looking at rape, overwhelmingly male perpetrators. When you're looking at non-contact sexual violence, overwhelmingly male perpetrators. But when you're looking at unwanted sexual contact, sexual coercion to make to penetrate violence, overwhelmingly the perpetrators are women, right? And this is an aspect of sexual violence. This is an aspect of sexual assault that, despite being in national data sets, the US Academy is not ready to really talk about. And it's particularly important for Black men because, again, our patterns of sexual violence and sexual debut are very, very different than the mainstream white communities in the United States. White communities have often dealt with unidirectional violence, right? They're just starting to talk about bidirectionality or the abuse of men, both in domestic violence situations and in by rape or made to penetrate violence. But in the Black community, the disproportionate early exposure of Black men to sexual debut and sexual assault has been documented by white sociologists since the 1950s. It's just that the ideological and paradigmatic views of gender, where woman means victim and male means perpetrator, Black men have been pigeonholed into the perpetrator lens, and it's been a complete ignore and erasure of the fact that Black men are overwhelmingly victims, even when the perpetrators are not only other men in their communities, but even in these cases where lifetime prevalence shows that women are the majority of the perpetrators. So there's a lot that Black patterns of sexual assault and Black male vulnerability to sexual assault demonstrate that really contradicts and refutes the assumptions of the US Academy.
That is pretty astounding, of course. And I want to have you elaborate a little bit on, some of the things that you're saying here that I think are really important. One is this idea of made to penetrate for people who don't understand what is that. And number two, what do you mean talking about bidirectional measurements versus the opposite? Yeah, unidirectional.
So I'll start with the letter. Unidirectional violence was largely the dominant theory of rape and domestic violence introduced by Ellen Pence and Michael Payamar under the Duluth model in the 1980s. The theory was that because you live in a patriarchal society, men will use sexual violence like rape or domestic abuse to enforce power against women. They thought this was part of the natural pattern and organization of patriarchal society, specifically within the home. The problem is that during the same period of time, these very same theorists thought that didn't apply to Black people because they thought Black people were less civilized and less evolved. So rather than having unidirectional patterns of patriarchal violence, they thought that Black people were just violent, more criminal prone, and would beat each other. So you can see this, of course, in the work that I've done on subculture violence theory and the impact that that's had on early feminist thought, where they thought, well, look, Black people are just naturally violent. They're naturally prone to crimes. So in fact, people like Farrakouti and Wolfgang actually argued that you saw higher patterns of intimate partner homicide of women killing their husbands precisely because Black men weren't actual patriarchs. They were weak. So women had more breadwinning power. So they enforced their power over their husbands and killed them, which is why you have disproportionate rates of Black men being killed in spousal homicides from 1976 forward, right, up to the 1990s. So everything they said about us was pathological, right? So bidirectionality was really thought to be something that affected Black and brown people and not white people. The impact of that, however, is that it didn't allow us to see the complexities involved with domestic violence. It assumed racial pathology as a basis to explain disproportionate rates of male victimization and female victimization and perpetration on both sides, right? So your first question, made to penetrate violence. So a lot of people don't know that the definition of rape in the United States actually changed January 1st, 2013. The old definition, or what the UCR, the FBI refers to as the legacy definition, was the penetration or carnal knowledge of a female, right, without her consent. But the new definition of rape really takes into account not only penetration, but being made to penetrate or forced to penetrate another person's body. And that could be through fingers, that could be, penile, et cetera. And I think that definition is much better. It brings it more in line with international standards or laws or procedures of sexual violence. But many Americans and academics haven't kind of caught up, right? They still think of rape in terms of the old legacy definition. And because of that, they haven't understood that young boys, or even boys, we see this in conflict situations all the time, are usually forced under the threat of violence to penetrate other people's bodies. When you're talking about war and conflict, of course, under the threat of death with guns, right? People are often made to have sex with family members or children, right, for entertainment of the oppressor. In the United States, we see this more domestically in the sense that younger Black boys are often under threat of coercion and force, made to penetrate, the vaginas or anuses of other adults or older children. And that's a kind of victimization that falls under the definition of rape now. And it's because of this redefinition that you see almost equality between the numbers of victims. Roughly 1.26 million female victims and 1.27 female victims and 1.26 million male victims of sexual victimization and rape in the United States. And it's so important because it really takes into account the vulnerability that the penis has, that the young boys have as having penises, and why the penises is not simply an instrument of penetration, but can be made to penetrate without consent, and how the kinds of effects that this has on a young boy's mentality, his psychological makeup, his self-esteem, and even his notion of consent and agency are always wrapped up in whether or not physical violence or coercion was used to make him penetrate other people's bodies.
I think what's so fascinating about what you're saying is, me, and perhaps it's just like how much I've read into a lot of this work, but it's like, it doesn't sound that outrageous, like this, there's such a movement now about just consent. And even this idea, even if we take that at its word, how often have we heard Black superstars, Black musicians speak about their experiences? I'm thinking Chris Brown, I'm thinking people who were literally talking about the way they were sexually assaulted or raped as children, right? And they're saying this, and nobody was ever questioning that. But if we think just about who can even give consent, legally in the US, it's like, duh, like, of course, so many young Black boys and men should be a part of this discussion. And it's like you said, it's not happening, but it's out there. Like, people are saying this.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of astounding, kind of the pushback against that. I also think that you are touching on something that's so brilliant too, because what you're doing in this talk is you're showing the numbers, and you're showing, you're talking about, hey, we are seeing this amongst Black women, and we are seeing it amongst Black men. And it speaks to something larger that I thought, something that you shared with me, and something that I learned through this work, and that has also been argued before, is that there's something about the environment, the societal environment that we are in, that speaks to our existence much more. And this is why, using kind of these white ideas and white definitions and applying it to our communities doesn't make sense. Like, clearly our community has been harmed tremendously, continues to be harmed in a way that it doesn't make sense to assume that Black women are not affected by this too. And so when we see this violence, or we see this sort of behavior, to me, it made total sense that you're going to see it with Black men and Black women and Black girls and Black boys, because we're all impacted in this environment.
Absolutely.
Could you talk about
Absolutely.
that?
No, but I think place makes a difference, right? I mean, we could have broke this down. They did a logistical regression in the 2019 article, looking at education, environment, et cetera. And the reality of the situation is that if you come from a marginalized environment, if you're in a marginalized neighborhood, you're going to see the effects of this. And this is not going to be, I think the problem in the US Academy is that we hold so closely to identity and to categories that we want to take all the pain and claim that it's ours, right? And we're not understanding that the pain is everywhere, because our duty as academics is not to narcissistically claim that it belongs to our group, but to understand why it affects so many of the people that look like us, right? That suffer in the society. Like, this chart also showed that generally men are having earlier sexual debut, right? So this is generally a male problem, right? That you're having statutory rape happen as a first sexual experience, but it just disproportionately affects Black boys. So we have to have a larger understanding, right, of what the numbers reveal and what this actually says about our duties to take these subjects very seriously and study them very honestly. But I did want to say one other thing is that notice too that the work that I'm doing just requires us to take a picture of what's happening in our society, our own communities, and try to figure it out. Like, nobody comes out of oppression clean. And I think that what happens with sexual assault is that that the discourse and the theories are being utilized and manipulated to demonize certain populations of a group. So you have an extremely negative view about Black men and boys. You think that they're criminals. You think that they're hypersexual and hypermasculine and rapists. So you just manipulate the data sets to show that, because there's no reason that, given the wealth of academics we have in the United States, that nobody's found 5.6 in the CDC NISVS data set, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. So there has to be some deliberate program that's trying to make us not take as seriously, or even flat out erase the victimization that so many young Black men and boys are actually experiencing in the world. And I think it's necessary for us to be real about what's happening in our communities so that we can shift the paradigm, right? The theories that white people introduce to explain sexual violence don't have to be the only theories. We see very clearly there's another reality that stands before us. And if we want to solve sexual violence, we have to solve people that are hurt by it so that they don't also re-victimize people in the future. Like our anti-violence, our anti-rape, our anti-sexual assault activism has to take the victimization of Black men more seriously. Because when it leaves that trauma untended to, it only creates powder kegs where different cycles of multi-generational pain and suffering are going to keep happening. You can't, I think the cultural logic now is criminalize Black men and remove them from society. But you're not understanding that in that community, you're constantly reproducing more trauma and pain, because it's not about the Black man, it's about the unrelenting cycle of violence that's happening to these young boys by older women, by male caretakers, and by society in general.
Yes. I want to ask you a question, because this actually touches on exactly what you're saying. Why don't you think we have more activism towards Black men and boys right now?
That's a loaded question. If I'm going to be honest, I think we have to start really accepting the role that anti-Black misandry plays in our existence.
What is that?
So anti-Black misandry are the cumulative negative assertions, stereotypes around Black men and boys that legitimize lethal violence, sanction, or outright disregard for their death and dying that we see throughout American society. Said differently, it's when you can look at a chart and see that Black men have died the most from COVID, or the most from, or suffer the most from incarceration, and then say that that doesn't matter. Right? They just don't matter. They're so dehumanized and despised in society that nothing, no form of suffering that they endure actually changes the way that we think or our compassion towards them as a group. And I think that we have to start having real conversations about kind of the dehumanized status and position of young Black men and boys in the United States. Because right now, I think that young Black men and boys are kind of used as scapegoats and tokens for violence in our communities. And what that means is everything becomes a function of their masculinity. We explain higher rates of intimate partner violence in the Black community through masculinity. And again, we ignore the fact that most of the violence is bidirectional. It happens on both sides. We ignore that the communities that this violence happens in usually are poor and economically deprived, right? And we ignore that these people usually don't have access to resources or mental health facilities. So we create a stew, right, or an environment of neglect, of trauma, of depression, of competition for resources. Then we're surprised that violence happens there, right? That's not. I don't think it takes any miraculous sociological study to explain. Well, that's going to be a more probable place for violence, right? And I think the other part is that I think there's a fear of Black men, right? Like we don't see the beauty of Black men. We don't see the vulnerability of Black men, right? And we judge Black men more for our uses of them than how they actually exist in the world. So we select, queer Black men. We want to say something about that agenda. We pick straight Black men. We want to say something about that agenda. We pick trans men. We want to say something about that agenda. We don't see Black men as having a consciousness. We don't see them as having a culture. We don't see them having a presence or an aesthetic that they present to the world, right? That's full of experience and life. And because of that, we don't value them as human beings. It becomes very easy to disregard this pain because we don't think that they contribute anything to our overall human civilization or the achievements that we see in humanity. And that's a really fearful thing for me as an academic, because what I see is more and more evidence coming out about Black men suffering, be it economic, political, or sexual, and more resistance and disregard to really engaging and studying them as a subject of inquiry.
Wow. That is a beautiful thing to say about, the complexities of Black men. Like we yeah, we needed something. And this is why I think your work is really important, that allowed Black men to be complex, not, we're gonna have so much to us. And I thought the highlighting of the vulnerabilities that Black men face was so, and is still so, so important. Another concept you came up with is phallicism.
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought it was, and I think it's such a useful and important concept because it made me think about, again, talking to people about rape and sexual assault, and students here, like being able to talk to students about it. And I had to remind students that, yes, Black women were raped during slavery, but so were Black men. So
Absolutely.
were like oftentimes it was almost like people forgot that, that they could be raped by
Yeah.
these slave owners, not just the men. And I had to convince them and communicate, like, it wasn't just it wasn't just slave owner white men who were raping them, but they were, but also the women. The women
Yes.
were raping them too, like forcing them to have sex with them, and threatening to have them killed, to say that they were raped if they would not have sex with them, which
Absolutely.
is, when you think about that, that's such an incredibly damaging and destructive thing to do to someone, to one, force Black men to watch their wives be raped in one
Mhm.
instance, and then to rape them in
Yes.
another, and then to strip all any concept of manhood from them, so that they can't protect their family. They can't. That it's such a double whammy. And so I thought, and I think we have such incredible and important discussions of what that has done to Black women, which makes a lot of sense. But I had never heard somebody say that about what that happened to Black men. People using that language of
Mhm.
Black men being raped, I felt like wasn't happening very often,
No.
And so, yeah, and I think this idea that, whites were turning Black people into just big Black penises, that they could do what they wanted,
Mhm.
just whatever with, project all their fears and their phobias and desires onto. That's such an important discussion to have. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, we make all kind of connections. Like I'm thinking of a piece by Adrienne Davis where she talks about sexual harassment started in slavery for Black women. It started with the rape on the plantation. Well, then I'm like, but why not make that connection with Black men? I was like, look at the numbers. Like you just saw the disproportionate rates. You saw the confidence intervals, right? Like it's not, it's not something, it's not something where we can keep denying that this is actually happening to Black men and boys currently. So then we have to ask, well, then what has conditioned Black men and boys historically to be part of this situation so that they're fungible to the sexual whims and desires of other people? And the answer, again, resides in slavery. It resides in Jim Crow. One of the things that I have in my possession that I haven't transcribed yet is an actual testimony from an older Black man who lived in the Jim Crow South, who was a victim of rape when he was working on plantations in the South. And the stories mirror what we have when we're talking about slavery. The reality of the situation is that Black people were fungible. They became what white people wanted to become. And they were basically pornographic actors for white people. There wasn't Pornhub back then. So
Mm-hmm.
white people utilized Black bodies, including Black male bodies, to perform sexual acts for their entertainment and for their pleasure. And one of the things that happens during that is not only Black men being raped by men or raped by white women, but also them being forced to penetrate, right? The story of Elizabeth Atwood that Thomas Foster starts his article, The Sexual Abuse of Black Men in America, with, is a powerful demonstration. Because, I challenge my students, how do we think about the position of the enslaved Black man, right? He's both being raped and he's forced to be the rapist. And phallicism is trying to communicate that duality of Black male oppression. We have historically been called the rapists when we were innocent, and we were raped simultaneously in a world that said that we couldn't be raped by women and men, by people in our neighborhoods, by women in our communities, by men who are supposed to take care of us. There is a problem with how the Black male body is configured and able to be imposed upon through various forms of violence. And because we are so indifferent to this body, we cannot see just the various, vertices and vortexes of these forces. There's never been a subject in history that's been able to hold the contradictory feature of existence that Black males can. To say someone is a rapist usually means they're not raped, but that's not the case for the Black male. To say that someone is hyper masculine but feminine, usually it's a contradiction of terms, but it's not historically a contradiction of terms for the Black male. The Black male is such a fascinating and rich subject of inquiry because it forces us to deal with these concrete conceptual contradictions that it would blow many of the disciplines that we have currently in the Western Academy out of the water. But because we forced Black male bodies into opprobrium where we can't speak about them for the sheer disgust we hold about them as being violent, that we don't even begin to ask necessary research questions that allow us to even see or unearth or peel back, right, the illusion of Black men as violent, to see all of these rich vulnerabilities that really tell us something about the way society is structured. Right? If you've been raping Black men since slavery and Jim Crow, that tells you something about the penetration of Black men by police. It tells you about the sexualization of the language of murder around white vigilantes. It explains something about all these cases of white teachers that are raping young Black male students. It tells you about the intimate partner violence and the disproportionate rates of female perpetrated intimate partner violence and statutory rape in Black communities. These things are all interrelated because it's about how you define Black. And we choose to argue about identity, and we choose to argue about claiming different aspects of sexual orientation without trying to get to the root of what's actually creating the contradiction in all Black men, regardless of those identity markers.
Yeah, excellent point. I want to ask you about, I'm thinking about, again, when we talk about structural and systemic and societal violence, what that means and why it's so problematic to get caught up. And I see this happen all the time. And, like identity and feelings. And it astounds me how many people claim they care about changing society and, systems and structures, but then are again, like, no, basically just saying, I feel this way, so this is what it is.
Yeah.
Why do we need to be cautious and blatantly, why do we need to move away from this sort of thinking?
Because feelings are not evidence in the sense that my work tries to look at social patterns of violence and inequity, and it forces me to be more humanistic in my approach towards inquiry. And what I mean by that is, just like the data, the disproportionate levels of early sexual debut that I showed at the very beginning, right, of reporting sexual debut before the age of 13. There were Hispanic boys on that chart too, right? There were white boys on that chart. Am I supposed to be indifferent to them? Right? Like my feelings and my compassion towards Black men and boys require me to have compassion to other people who find themselves in a certain circumstance. And it's because of that that I'm interested in social change. Right? The reason that I'm interested, because I'm interested in sexual assault and sexual violence and rape, is the same reason that I'm not excluding chart 5.3 that shows the rates of victimization for Black women and other groups of women. Right? Because I'm not drawn to find the greatest victim or make sure that victim looks like me, I can approach the understanding that violence happens to multiple bodies at multiple vectors simultaneously. And then we have to solve the problem to increase the overall health of all groups. That's a population level discussion. That's a public health discussion. It's not one tailored purely to identity politics. And I may choose to help the groups that are most disproportionately affected, but that doesn't mean that the policies that I'm endorsing or the perspectives that I'm endorsing come at the expense of any other group. The reason that we see disproportionate rates around multiracials, indigenous, and Black people is because you also find higher forms of social marginalization and economic marginalization around these groups of people, right? That's a population level discussion. That doesn't happen because I told a story. Me telling you a story, the snapshots don't tell you how to fix that problem. They tell you there is a problem. Policy has to address the problem. And what we have today is people who say, because I feel a certain way or because I champion this group over another group, I don't have to care about the violence in any other group. But what they don't understand, and again, this is what I mean when I say if you take a family conflict or a victim-centered approach, that violence that you don't care about produces other victims. I want to decrease violence overall, which means that I have to solve and care about the victimization of Black men and Black women. I have to understand what produces perpetrators. I have to understand the psychological makeup of the kinds of environments that allow violence to move freely within marginalized societies and communities. That means that I have to have a community-centered basis. I can't just pick Black men. I have to, what is their interaction with their mothers? Why are their mothers not able to protect them? What's the relationship with their fathers? Why are their fathers not able to protect? Right? These are real questions that we have to ask at a really public health level to understand what's happening in communities and then deploy social workers, right? The people who know how to deal with this out to help us fix these problems. But that's not going to happen if we keep producing scholarship that's based on how I feel about certain groups, which allows tremendous bias to creep in, especially against Black men, right? All Black men are perpetrators, they're not victimized, right? And not attend to how we're producing a certain kind of psychological makeup and history of trauma that may impact or impede our abilities to actually decrease sexual violence in these communities.
Wow, that's powerful and that's beautiful. I mean, you've written also about, other racialized males. I'm thinking your work on Jewish men and the history of sexual violence towards them. So yeah, there's definitely work that you've done to really speak to, several groups. A
Yes.
lot of people are impacted in these same scenarios. And so, yeah, I think that really resonates. One of my, we're running a little out of time. So one of my last questions for you that I think is really important too, and it kind of touches on everything about the academy, about some of the work we're talking about, kind of the resistance that we have and why we might not see activism around these issues, is oftentimes people associate sexual assault and violence as something that happens in a patriarchal society towards women only. But one of your interventions too is how, thinking of Black men as equal to or desiring to be like white patriarchs is the absolute wrong way to do this.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
this obviously speaks to, again, what you were saying about our community is not the same as white people. We can't be doing this in that sort of way. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to take credit for it. I think that I've introduced that argument quite forcefully theoretically, but I really have to reach back to Robert Staples' work on Black masculinity and Anthony LaMelle Jr.'s work. As you know, was a queer Black male sociologist that doesn't get half the amount of credit that he deserves for exploring issues on Black masculinity and Black male deviance. These arguments have been made to a certain extent. What I did under Black male studies is give them a kind of theoretical force and historical orientation that beyond description, sociological description. But Black men don't, and I like him because I like LaMelle's work because he's using all kind of confidence intervals and he's doing chi-squared analysis,
Yeah.
to show that like the odds of like Black masculinity, mentioned with Black men are not white men. There's
Yeah.
no empirical measure that you can point to beyond general assimilation, right? Like Black men want to be fathers or they want to provide for their families. Beyond those general measures, Black men just don't match up psychologically or sociologically with white men. And that's straight Black men or queer Black men, et cetera. They just don't do it, right? We have completely different views of manhood. So the idea that we want to imitate white men literally comes from the most racist colonial discourses that have ever been introduced in the face of the Western world. Because in the early 20th century, these ideas came about because Black men were thought to be childlike, that they would enter into an Oedipal complex. And let's be very honest, as I show in Decolonizing the Intersection, that's what feminism picked up. They said, you see this in Shulamita Firestone's book, The Dialectic of Sex, that Black men basically are children who are being introduced to a white society. So the only position they can have to white men is that of the child where they emulate them. That's where these ideas come from. And they come from this because the view is that Black men had no masculinity, they had no cultural tropes or their own independence of Black manhood. So the only thing they could do was fall victim to the master patriarch. And this orientation of patriarchy doesn't come from any empirical studies. This comes from a bunch of feminists in the 1970s reading psychoanalysis and coming up with these theories. And this is what I mean when I say that we're not being honest about where these ideas come from. It's one thing if we say, look at all the data that shows that we have this psychological disposition of Black men. How do we fix this? That's not the issue. You have a whole bunch of people with degrees in English asserting that this is the case, like bell hooks, and that becomes the dominant dogma for the last 30 years of interpreting Black masculinity. There is no data point that suggests this. All the evidence goes the other way. And I think it's especially dangerous because what it does is it suggests to us that there's a pathology in Black men where they can't create their own positive values, that somehow Black men deal with trauma only in terms of negative coping mechanisms, that they're only reactionary. And we don't do this for other groups. Like white women literally birth white men. They live with white men. They marry white men. They're raised by white men. But somehow they have this revolutionary feminist consciousness that seems to do everything that white men already did. Right. But they're not interpreted that way. But you take a black man who was enslaved and raped and murdered and pillaged and almost died by, population level violence, and they somehow want to be their oppressor. It doesn't make any sense. Why this one group? Why this particular group? We don't read Jewish. We don't say Jewish men wanted to be Germans, right? Because we think that the aversion that Jewish people have to the Holocaust and that violence would never allow us that association. But with Black people, because of the notions of racial inferiority, we seem to believe that Black men ultimately want to be white men. I think it's offensive. I think that it has no basis in actual science, and it's just an accumulation of second wave feminist dogma being translated and picked up under various intersectional discourses through psychoanalytic theory. When you look at Black men concretely, when you look at how they view families or how they view love or how they talk about even same-sex relationships, right? Gibson talks about it in terms of the salvific, eros that Black men have with each other. You can't get to that point, And I think what I'm so happy about is that you see so many different Black male scholars, yourself, Gibson, Sawyer, really pushing back at a concrete, level, right? How we experience the world. And I think that these ways of reorienting how we think about Black men, how we think about Black male psychology and Black male self-identification are going to fundamentally change how we interpret not only Black males, but racialized males generally. Because these old decadent theories that are rooted in criminology and just white pathology can't fully express our humanity and ultimately seek to deny our victimization and vulnerability.
Wow. Okay. Dr. Curry, I want to give it 2 more minutes, but I want you to give us your thoughts, your last kind of statements on this, but how do we address, again, as Black people who care about Black people, all Black people, how do we address, or what are some of the routes we can take to start seriously addressing sexual assault and violence in our communities, and especially the sexual assault and violence of Black men and boys?
So, very difficult question, but some of the evidence-based solutions are, of course, sexual education, teaching young Black boys that they can be victims of sexual assault, that they're more likely than other groups and their female counterparts to be victims of sexual assault at a much earlier age. Focus groups in communities and mental health workshops. Black men seem to have better reports and health outcomes when they actually speak to peer groups about depression, self-image, self-esteem, and sexual experience. I think those models can be introduced at various levels. And third, we need Black academics to take more serious interventionist and humanistic approaches to the study of Black men and boys. That we have to have more public health scholars that are willing to actually, push up against the wave and start investigating this problem. And I think this needs to be an active debate in the academy rather than like 1 or 2 people saying it. We need to really talk about how Black men experience sexual debut and how they understand sexual violation and their vulnerability to rape, not only as perpetrators, but also as victims of it. And of course, lastly, I have to say, we have to expand the conversation around female perpetrators of sexual violence. The issue isn't just the victimization of Black men and boys, but it's also about the perpetrators, right? Some of which we accept. If we talk about Black men raping Black boys, everybody's fine. The world stays in order because we accept that Black men are rapists. But again, the data shows that overwhelmingly, in terms of lifetime prevalence, women are the majority of the male to penetrate perpetrators and the contact sexual violence. So we need to talk about the boundaries and educate women into the kinds of power they have to victimize children and young men that they care for. And there's a level of trust there that's being betrayed because young boys don't understand, they're not being taught that they could be victimized by these older women or even their peers. So there has to be a re-socialization across the board about consent, sexual victimization and assault, and the duality of rape, both in terms of penetrating and being made to penetrate other bodies.
Wow, thank you so much. That was so important. This conversation was so incredible. I want to thank you with my whole heart, Dr. Curry. Not only are you an incredible scholar and do amazing, important work, but you are the partner to another incredible scholar.
Oh, yeah.
And and the father of two beautiful daughters. And so I see and understand, two beautiful Black daughters. Like, I understand how much this, I just appreciate your love for Black people and your desire to really just, work in our community and make difference in our communities, and why that's so important, because there ain't a lot of us out there.
Oh, no, there's certainly not. Certainly not.
Thank you to all who are watching on Facebook Live. I'm going to repost this so you can watch it from the beginning if you didn't get the chance. I'll also post it on Instagram, and I'll post it on my Patreon page. And for those of you following me on Patreon, I'm going to have a special conversation with Dr. Curry right after this. That's just some fun questions if you want to get to know him a little better. So follow me on Patreon, and you can click on my page to see how to do that. It's definitely worth it. And again, all proceeds will go to the Sexual Assault Crisis Center in the Fox Cities. Once again, thank you, Dr. Curry, for all your support in this, for giving your time that's so precious to help get this out. Thank you for allowing me to post this so that we can educate the public. And thank you for all of you out there who are watching. Click the link, donate, support, and let's do our parts to end sexual assault and violence in our communities. Let me stop the record. I should probably figure out how to stop.
You clicked on it, said stop.
Okay.
It stopped recording. I guess we're still live.
Let me stop the live stream.